An American Plague by Jim Murphy. Chapter 8. This Unmerciful Enemy. Death mounted on his pale horse and seemed to ride triumphant. There was but a step between the people and the city and the tomb. Elihan Winchester, 1795. Saturday, October 12th. The committee and its many subcommittees were in place and operating smoothly. Problems of every sort were being addressed and solved. Bush Hill had been turned around so thoroughly that people now clamored to be admitted. So many applied that patients had to have a doctor's certificate stating that they did indeed have yellow fever in order to be let in. These efforts certainly had a calming effect on the populace, and the worst of the panic began to ease. But the fever showed no sign of relenting. If anything, it was gaining strength and deadliness. On Monday, October 7, a total of 82 dead were carted away for burial. 90 died on Friday and 111 on Saturday. Tents were set up at the cemeteries so that gravediggers could rest but never be far from their ceaseless work. The Reverend Mr. Helmuth was pondering this unmerciful enemy as he made his way through the city. Over the previous 6 days, 130 of his Lutheran congregation had been carried off, and his church's tiny burial ground was looking more and more like a plowed field. Could it be, he wondered, that Lutherans caught the sickness more easily than Quakers, Methodists, or Catholics? His Lutheran colleague, the Reverend John Schmidt, had the fever, and his parish gravedigger and the gravedigger's mother had already succumbed. All this calamity surrounded Helmuth, but he stayed in the city and made daily door-to-door visits, cautiously walking deserted streets and abandoned alleyways with a trembling heart. House after house was decorated with a tiny red flag, the sign that yellow fever had invaded it. Block after block was empty and still. Those few Philadelphians he encountered shunned him, just as they shunned the black nurses, gravediggers, carters of the dead, doctors, bloodletters, and anyone who worked at or even visited Bush Hill. Nighttime was worse. Without the hired lamplighters, most of the city's 662 well-oiled lamps remained unlit. The surrounding areas cast into a gloomy darkness. Such a deep silence reigned in the streets after 9 o'clock, Helmuth wrote. I perfectly recollect several visits of the sick which I had to make entirely alone at that time of the night. Houses shut up to the right and left, deserted by their inhabitants or containing persons struggling in death at the very time, or whose former inhabitants were all dead already. Occasionally the stench of death would fill Helmuth's nose and demand his attention. On one block of narrow apple tree alley, he counted 40 dead. Most often the minister was attracted by the pitiful shrieks and calls of the sick in the final stages of the disease. Such distress upset and frightened him, but it also strengthened his conviction that Philadelphia had brought it all on itself. After such a merry, sinful summer, he mused, by the just judgment of God, a most mournful autumn followed. Helmuth wasn't the only one who realized that the fever was winning. On October 17, committee member Caleb Lowndes wrote in the official minutes, from the accounts received from different quarters of the city, it is evident that the disorder has for the last week been more general and alarming than at any time since its appearance. Even with his mercury and jalap cure in hand, Benjamin Rush looked about him and understood that Philadelphia itself might succumb at any moment. Not a ray of alleviation of the present calamity breaks in our city from any quarter, he wrote to Julia. All is a thick and melancholic gloom. The weather did not help anyone's spirits. After rain fell on September 9, a warm, deadly dry spell followed, lasting over a month. Many people looked for rain, committee member John Bordley noted, which they believed would be fatal to the infection. Others looked only for mere cold, whether attended by rain or not, because histories of the fever assured them that cold had always been fatal to the infection. Rain finally fell on October 12 and then again on October 15, a steady shower that Philadelphians hoped would clean the air of fatal odors and wash away the foul, disease-causing matter in the streets. Benjamin Rush felt the rain on his face and rejoiced. The appearance of this rain was like a dove with an olive branch in its mouth. Yet 111 died on October 12 and 103 the next day. Clearly, the mysterious killing force was still in Philadelphia, still working its way into households despite every precaution, still infecting at an alarming rate. One man named Collins had lost his entire family, his wife, his two daughters, his son, and his son's wife and child early in the plague. He married again, and his new wife promptly died. Finally, at the height of the fever, his will to survive gave out. Mr. Collins caught the fever, and a few days later he joined the rest of his family members in the crowd at Potter's Field. More than just the fever was preying on those left in Philadelphia. The crime rate went up, and there was rioting. Few first-hand accounts make mention of the law-breaking and violence. Apothecary shops were broken into and medicine stolen. Food was taken from the few farmers' wagons to appear in town. The committee decided to ignore the problem, at least on the public record, and concentrate instead on keeping people alive. Benjamin Rush mentions the disruptions in a few brief references, but provides no details. The Treasury clerk, Joshua Dawson, did note fine doings in the river, easy means of smuggling, and most likely little precaution taken to prevent it. Outsiders already looked upon Philadelphia as a blighted area. Why, these Philadelphia citizens probably decided to smudge the city's reputation even further, and possibly drive away future business, which detailed written accounts of looting and violence. One thing they did mention was the grasping hand of the landlords. Tenants, made jobless by the fever, ran out of rent money and were turned out of their homes. Even famous and beloved citizens felt the landlord's bite. One day, Benjamin Rush returned home to discover that his landlord, the annoyed owner of Bush Hill, William Hamilton, had raised his rent and was demanding 3 months' payment in advance. The committee could not stop the evictions, but they did attempt to assist renters with small cash advances. These handouts were not meant to provide long-term assistance, but rather to see the individual or family through the week ahead. In a few instances, the charity only lined the pockets of the greedy. One landlord told the committee that her tenants needed immediate financial help in order to survive, and was granted the money requested. After pocketing the money herself, she seized the tenant's clothing and put everything out on the street anyway. October seemed to have brought out the very worst in the fever and in many of Philadelphia's citizens. It was during these terrible days that Benjamin Rush once again began to feel weak and feverish. Yellow fever had invaded his body for a second time, and despite his own insistence that his cure needed to be administered at the first signs of fever, he did not have himself bled or purged. He left no explanation for shunning his cure. Perhaps he felt his illness was mild in comparison to his first experience. Perhaps one encounter with his cure was enough. Whatever the reason, Rush tried to ignore his condition and carried on his medical practice as best he could, visiting patients from morning to night. His joints ached painfully. He had no appetite, and his terrible night sweats returned. When he did manage to nod off, his sleep was haunted by disturbing and frightful dreams. The scenes of them were derived altogether from sick rooms and graveyards. Still, he rose every morning and set off on his mission, often dressed in the same tattered and soiled clothes he had worn the day before. He collapsed in a patient's room on October 4th and had to be carried home. He was up again 2 days later, but the yellow fever would not relent. He fainted again on October 9. Finally, he took his own cure once more. "It puked me several times," he would record, "and next morning it operated downwards and relieved me." This time, however, Rush did not rebound so quickly. He was confined to his bed, unable even to raise his head for 6 straight days, during the absolute peak of the fever. It did not seem that the situation could get much worse. Then reports began to filter in that the fever had appeared in the out parts of Philadelphia, what we would call the suburbs. Communities such as Frankfort, Southwark, and the Northern Liberties trembled as cases appeared among them despite their efforts to keep it out. The plague seemed truly unstoppable. There wasn't much anyone could do except carry on as best as possible. The committee continued to operate and solve problems. Patients were cared for at Bush Hill. Members of the Free African Society went door to door offering assistance. The few remaining doctors administered whatever medical attention they thought might work, and quacks offered a variety of home-brewed powders and teas. Philip Freneau chose to combat the plague with denial and humor. as editor of the National Gazette, Freneau struggled as much to keep his paper in operation as he did to avoid the fever. Because supplies had become scarce after week 2 of the plague, Freneau had a hard time finding paper. Instead of the usual 4 to 8 pages, he was often forced to publish a single sheet. His National Gazette was also short on fever news. It avoided publishing most obituaries, never mentioned the rise in crime, and was vague about the spread of the disease. For real news, people turned to Andrew Brown's Federal Gazette, the only daily that operated without interruption throughout the crisis. Even so, Freneau did have an impact. He poked fun at those who fled the city as the power of opium to banish pain, and at the cruelty and indifference of those outside the city. His weapons of choice were brief dialogues and verse. The construction of his verse was often clumsy, possibly because of strict deadlines meant he had to work so quickly. He did manage to catch a vivid sense of the plague in one memorable poem called Pestilence. Hot, dry winds forever blowing, dead men to the graveyards going, constant hearses, funeral verses, oh, what plagues, there is no knowing. Priests retreating from their pulpits, some in hot and some in cold fits. In bad temper, off they scamper, leaving us unhappy culprits. Doctors raving and disputing, death's pale army still recruiting. What a pother, one with tother. Some a riding, some a shooting. Nature's poisons here collected, water, earth, and air infected. Oh, what pity such a city was in such a place erected. Humor might relieve the tension, but only for a few minutes. In time, the reader would look up and see the deserted streets, hear some nearby cry for help. The horror was all around and not likely to go away soon. During this sad, helpless time, another bit of verse appeared outside Woodston, New Jersey. Major Christian Piercy had fled Philadelphia after his son and an apprentice caught the fever, bribing a stagecoach driver to take him and his family to South Jersey. Piercy grew ill on the ride out to Camden, and the other passengers, including those from his household, put him out of the coach at Isaac Eldridge Farm. Eldridge would not allow the sick man in his house, but he did let Piercy stay in an abandoned log cabin in the woods. There, Piercy died and was buried without ceremony where he had fallen. Later, his family had a headstone put in place that bore this warning verse: "Stay, passengers, see where I lie. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me."